The morning of May 22nd, 1943, Lieutenant Commander William M. Drain climbed into the cockpit of his TBF Avenger torpedo bomber on the pitching deck of USS Bogue, an escort carrier riding heavy swells in the mid-Atlantic. The intelligence briefing had been specific. U-boats operating in this sector surfaced and were vulnerable, recharging batteries in waters they believed safe. Drain's aircraft carried 4 Mark 47 depth bombs, each weighing 350 pounds. His orders were simple: find them, attack them, sink them. What made this morning extraordinary was not the mission itself, but what it represented. For the first time in the war, an aircraft launched from an escort carrier, a ship the Navy privately called combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, was about to sink a German submarine in the open Atlantic. The U-boat crews had owned these waters for 3 years. By sunset, that certainty would begin to crumble. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The escort carrier program began not from strategic brilliance, but from desperation bordering on panic. In December 1940, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral William F. Halsey sent a letter to the Chief of Naval Operations that would change naval warfare. Halsey commanded the aircraft battle force of the U.S. fleet, and his assessment was bleak. America possessed 6 aircraft carriers. If war came simultaneously against Germany and Japan, those 6 carriers would prove catastrophically insufficient. The British were already bleeding in the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The mathematics was brutal. In 1942, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, believed he needed to sink 700,000 tons per month consistently to force Britain's surrender. In November 1942, he nearly achieved that figure. Convoys departing North America faced a killing zone in the mid-Atlantic, a gap beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats operated with near impunity. Patrol aircraft based in Newfoundland could escort convoys for roughly 700 miles. British aircraft based in Iceland could cover another 700 miles from the eastern approach. Between these protective umbrellas lay over 1,000 miles of open ocean where submarines surfaced freely, coordinated in wolfpacks through radio communication with Dönitz's headquarters in occupied France, and attacked convoys stripped of air cover. The British called this gap the Black Pit. U-boat crews called it Happy Hunting Grounds. In March 1943, wolfpacks sank 82 Allied ships in a single month, totaling 476,000 tons. The strategic situation was approaching catastrophe. Britain needed American production tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, fuel to continue the war. The Soviet Union needed American supplies to survive the German onslaught. Without control of the Atlantic sea lanes, the Allied war effort would strangle. President Franklin Roosevelt understood this with absolute clarity. In January 1941, even before America's formal entry into the war, Roosevelt pressured the Navy to develop a solution. The problem was simple to state and seemingly impossible to solve. Convoys needed air cover throughout the Atlantic crossing, but no land-based aircraft possessed sufficient range, and fleet carriers were desperately needed in the Pacific, where Japan was already threatening American interests. The Navy needed carriers that could escort slow convoys, provide air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap, and be produced quickly and cheaply enough to deploy in numbers. The solution was the escort carrier, a compromise so profound that many admirals initially opposed the entire concept. The first escort carrier commissioned by the United States Navy was USS Long Island, converted from the merchant ship Mail and commissioned in June 1941. Long Island was an experiment, a proof of concept that tested whether a merchant hull could be modified to launch and recover aircraft. The conversion was crude by fleet carrier standards. The ship retained much of its merchant vessel structure. A wooden flight deck was laid over the superstructure. A single elevator connected the flight deck to the hangar below. There was no island. The command bridge and navigation equipment were installed below deck to keep the landing area clear. Long Island could make 17 knots at maximum speed, barely faster than the convoys she was meant to protect, and she carried fewer than 20 aircraft. The British pioneered the concept months earlier with HMS Audacity, converted from the captured German merchant ship Hanover and commissioned in July 1941. Audacity escorted her first convoy in September and immediately proved the value of carrier-based aircraft against U-boats. During convoy battles in November and December 1941, Audacity's 6 Grumman Martlet fighters engaged German Fokker-Wulf Condor reconnaissance aircraft that shadowed convoys and directed U-boats to targets. The carrier's presence disrupted German tactics so severely that Admiral Dönitz personally prioritized sinking her. On December 21, 1941, U-751 torpedoed Audacity, and she sank with the loss of 73 crew members. But even in sinking, Audacity had proven the concept. Carrier-based aircraft could close the air gap. They could protect convoys in the mid-Atlantic, where land-based planes could not reach. The challenge was production. Converting individual merchant ships was too slow. The United States needed dozens of escort carriers, and it needed them immediately. This is where industrial improvisation replaced traditional naval architecture. Henry J. Kaiser, the industrialist who had built the massive Boulder, Bonneville, and Grand Coulee dams, and was already revolutionizing merchant ship production with Liberty ships built in under 2 months, proposed building escort carriers using assembly line techniques. Kaiser had never built a warship, but he understood mass production. His shipyards applied automobile manufacturing principles to shipbuilding prefabricated sections, constructed in different locations and assembled at the shipyard, standardized components that reduced customization, and parallel construction that allowed multiple ships to be built simultaneously. The Navy remained skeptical. Senior officers argued that merchant hulls were too weak, too slow, too limited to serve as effective warships. They wanted purpose-built carriers with proper armor, adequate speed to operate with the battle fleet, and sufficient aircraft capacity to engage enemy naval forces. Kaiser's proposal seemed like a wasteful diversion of resources from building real carriers, but Roosevelt overruled the objections. In June 1942, he authorized Kaiser's program under Maritime Commission management. The goal was audacious: 50 escort carriers in 21 months. The design specifications revealed just how much had been sacrificed to achieve speed and quantity. The Casablanca-class escort carriers, which would become Kaiser's primary production model, were 512 feet long, roughly half the length of an Essex-class fleet carrier. They displaced 10,400 tons compared to the Essex-class's 27,000 tons. Maximum speed was 19 knots, half the speed of fleet carriers. The armament consisted of one 5-inch gun, 16 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and 20 20mm guns, purely defensive weapons against aircraft. The carriers had no armor belt protecting the hull, no armored flight deck, minimal compartmentalization to contain damage. A single torpedo, striking in the right location, could sink these ships quickly. The flight deck was 477 feet long and 80 feet wide, barely sufficient for operating the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers that would form the air groups. The carriers had 2 elevators connecting the hangar deck to the flight deck and 1 catapult to assist aircraft launches. Standard air group composition was 9 Wildcat fighters and 12 Avenger torpedo bombers, though this varied by mission. The hangar could accommodate additional aircraft for transport missions, but operational air groups rarely exceeded 24 planes. Sailors immediately gave the escort carriers a collection of nicknames that revealed their attitude toward these vessels. Baby flattops emphasized their diminutive size compared to fleet carriers. Jeep carriers suggested they were the nautical equivalent of the small, utilitarian, expendable army vehicles. British sailors called them Woolworth carriers, after the American chain of inexpensive dime stores, suggesting they were cheap substitutes for real carriers. But the darkest nickname came from the sailors who served aboard them. CVE, the official Navy designation for carrier vessel escort, was said to stand for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. This was not mere dark humour. These ships truly were vulnerable. 7 U.S. escort carriers would be sunk during the war, a higher proportional loss rate than fleet carriers. The vulnerability came primarily from the aviation fuel system. Gasoline for aircraft was stored in tanks below the hangar deck. Early escort carrier designs attempted to minimize explosion risk by venting the fuel in tanks to the sea through the bottom of the hull. As fuel was pumped out for aircraft, seawater flowed into the tank, keeping it full and eliminating airspace where explosive gasoline vapors could accumulate. British naval architects hated this system, considering it dangerously unstable. When escort carriers were delivered to the Royal Navy through Lend-Lease, British engineers completely redesigned the fuel systems, added 1,200 to 2,000 tons of concrete ballast to improve stability, and lengthened flight decks where possible. These modifications delayed the carrier's entry into service by months, which frustrated American officers who believed the British were being overly cautious. The first combat deployment of U.S. escort carriers in the Atlantic began in March 1943, with USS Bogue assigned to protect convoy OWN 166 crossing from Britain to North America. Bogue's role was purely defensive: provide air cover for the convoy, engage any U-boats that approached, and prevent the wolfpack attacks that had devastated previous convoys. The results were mixed. Bogue's aircraft attacked several U-boats but failed to sink any during this first patrol. More importantly, the carrier's presence forced the U-boats to remain submerged, unable to coordinate attacks or maintain pursuit of the convoy. From the Germans' perspective, the appearance of carrier-based aircraft in mid-ocean was ominous but not yet decisive. What transformed escort carriers from defensive convoy protection to offensive submarine killers was a conceptual leap that occurred within the staff of Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. In April 1943, Captain Francis S. Lowe, who served on King's staff, proposed creating dedicated hunter-killer groups centered on escort carriers. Instead of tying carriers to convoys where they moved at the convoy's slow speed and predictable route, Lowe suggested forming task groups with 1 carrier and 4 to 6 destroyers, or destroyer escorts. These groups would have complete freedom of action to hunt submarines wherever intelligence indicated U-boat activity. The proposal was radical because it inverted the entire defensive philosophy. For 3 years, Allied strategy had focused on protecting convoys, sailing merchant ships in groups escorted by warships that defended against U-boat attacks. This was fundamentally reactive. The U-boats chose when and where to attack. Escorts responded to those attacks. Lowe's hunter-killer concept was proactive. Instead of waiting for U-boats to threaten convoys, the hunter-killer groups would seek out U-boats in their patrol areas and sink them before they could reach convoys. The mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats had operated safely, would become a killing ground for submarines. Admiral King approved the concept, and the 10th Fleet was established in May 1943 specifically to coordinate anti-submarine operations. Rear Admiral Francis Lowe, who had proposed the hunter-killer concept, became King's chief anti-submarine warfare officer. The organizational structure was deliberately streamlined. The 10th Fleet had no ships of its own. Instead, it controlled task groups assigned from the Atlantic Fleet, coordinated intelligence from ultra-code-breaking operations that read German naval communications, analyzed U-boat patrol patterns, and directed hunter-killer groups to areas where submarines were likely to be operating. The intelligence advantage was extraordinary. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had broken the German Enigma cipher system, allowing Allied intelligence to read encrypted communications between U-boats and Admiral Dönitz's headquarters. While the Germans occasionally changed their cipher systems, causing temporary blackouts in intelligence, the Allies could generally read German naval communications within hours. This meant that when Dönitz ordered U-boats to form a patrol line across a specific section of the Atlantic, Allied intelligence knew the approximate location before the submarines arrived. Hunter-killer groups could be positioned to intercept. The first hunter-killer group, deployed in March 1943, built around USS Bogue and designated Task Group 21.11. Bogue's commanding officer, Captain Giles E. Short, was ordered to operate independently in the Central Atlantic, hunting U-boats rather than escorting convoys. The initial results were disappointing. Bogue's aircraft attacked several U-boats during April and early May, but achieved no confirmed kills. The tactics were still being developed. Pilots were learning how to coordinate attacks between fighters and torpedo bombers. Destroyer escorts were learning how to respond quickly to aircraft sightings and prosecute submerged contacts with depth charges. Then, on May 22, 1943, Lieutenant Commander William M. Drain achieved the breakthrough. Flying a TBF Avenger from USS Bogue as part of a routine patrol 60 miles ahead of convoy on 184, Drain spotted U-231 running on the surface at twilight. The U-boat had been shadowing the convoy, waiting for darkness to attack. Drain immediately pushed his Avenger into a shallow glide and released all 4 depth bombs directly over U-231's conning tower as the submarine began its crash dive. The explosions bracketed the U-boat's hull. U-231's bridge structure was wrecked, her pressure hull damaged. She could not remain at sea and was forced to abort her patrol and return to France for repairs. This was not technically a sinking, but it was the first time an aircraft from an escort carrier had damaged a U-boat severely enough to abort its patrol. More importantly, it demonstrated that escort carrier aircraft could locate and attack U-boats in the open Atlantic, even at twilight when visibility was poor. The German advantage of attacking at night when escorts couldn't see them was being eroded by aircraft that could patrol after sunset and spot surfaced submarines from altitude. The following day, May 23rd, brought the first confirmed kill. Lieutenant Junior Grade William F. Chamberlain, flying another Avenger from Bogue, was running down a high-frequency direction finder signal evidence of a U-boat transmitting to headquarters when he sighted U-569 on the surface, just 20 miles behind convoy on 184. Chamberlain's Avenger dropped 4 depth bombs that landed close to the submarine's conning tower. U-569 submerged, but had been mortally damaged. She sank with all hands. It was the first U-boat sunk by aircraft operating from an escort carrier, and it opened the floodgates. The mathematics of submarine warfare shifted decisively in the summer of 1943. In May, 41 German U-boats were sunk, the highest monthly loss rate of the entire war to that point. Admiral Dönitz, shocked by the casualties, temporarily withdrew most submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. German submariners called it Black May. The U-boat crews had believed themselves masters of the Atlantic, capable of sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Instead, submarines were being destroyed faster than German shipyards could build them. The strategic equation had inverted. USS Card, under Captain Arnold J. Isbell, became the prototype for aggressive hunter-killer operations. Isbell took Card to sea in July 1943 with Task Group 21.14, consisting of the carrier and 3 Clemson-class destroyers, USS Bory, USS Goff, and USS Barry. These destroyers were elderly, commissioned during World War I, with flush deck designs that made them poor seaboats in Atlantic storms. They were slow, lightly armed, and their depth charge capacity was limited. but they were available, and Isbell intended to use them aggressively. The carrier embarked Composite Squadron 1, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Carl E. Jones. The squadron consisted of 6 F-4F-4 Wildcat fighter bombers and 11 TBF-1 Avenger torpedo bombers. The Wildcats were primarily used for air patrol and could carry light bombs or depth charges. The Avengers were the primary submarine killers, each capable of carrying 4 Mark 47 depth bombs or a Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, a revolutionary new weapon that would transform anti-submarine warfare. The Mark 24, codenamed Fido by the Americans and kept highly classified throughout the war, was an acoustic homing torpedo designed specifically to hunt submarines. Unlike conventional torpedoes that traveled in a straight line, Fido circled after entering the water, listening with hydrophones for the sound of submarine propellers. When it detected the cavitation noise of a submarine's screws, it steered itself toward the sound and detonated against the hull. The weapon was devastating because U-boats had no warning and no defense. Even if a submarine dove after being attacked, the Fido would follow the sound signature until it found its target. Card departed Norfolk on July 27, 1943. Intelligence from ultra-intercepts indicated significant U-boat activity in the central Atlantic, particularly in the area where submarines transited to and from their patrol zones. Admiral Dönitz had positioned a patrol line designated Group Trutz across the convoy routes, and Card was ordered to disrupt it. This was hunter-killer operations in its purest form, not escorting a specific convoy, but actively seeking submarines wherever they operated. The first contact came on August 3rd. An Avenger pilot spotted U-613 on the surface, recharging batteries. The submarine crash-dived before the aircraft could attack, but the pilot marked the position with smoke floats and radioed Card. Destroyers Bory and Goff raced to the contact and began a depth charge attack. U-613 went deep and silent, evading the initial assault. The destroyers maintained contact for 6 hours, repeatedly attacking with depth charges. Eventually, U-613 surfaced, badly damaged and unable to continue submerged. The destroyers opened fire with their deck guns. The U-boat's crew abandoned ship, and U-613 sank. It was Card's first kill. 4 days later came the encounter that would become legendary in anti-submarine warfare. On August 7th, 5 Avengers from Card, led by Lieutenant Commander Howard M. Avery, spotted 2 U-boats conducting a refueling operation. U-117, a Type XB submarine designed specifically as a supply boat, was transferring fuel to U-66, a Type IXC combat submarine. The 2 vessels were alongside each other, connected by hoses and lines, completely vulnerable. The scene from the air must have seemed almost surreal. 2 massive submarines, each nearly 200 feet long, lashed together in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean over 1,000 miles from any land. U-117 displaced over 2,000 tons and carried 432 tons of diesel fuel specifically for refueling combat submarines at sea. These milch cow submarines, as the Germans called them, were critical to Dönitz's strategy because they allowed combat U-boats to remain on patrol far longer without returning to base. Sinking a milch cow was strategically more valuable than sinking a combat submarine because it reduced the operational range of multiple boats. The Avengers attacked immediately. The first pilot dropped depth bombs that straddled U-117's hull. The massive submarine shuddered under the explosions. U-66 immediately cast off the refueling lines and began a crash dive, desperate to escape. The second Avenger released a Fido acoustic torpedo into the water near U-117. The torpedo circled, listening, then locked onto the sound of U-117's engines still running. It accelerated toward the submarine and detonated against the pressure hull. U-117 was doomed. The pressure hull was breached. Seawater flooded the engineering spaces. The submarine could not dive, could not maneuver, could barely maintain buoyancy. The crew began abandoning ship, jumping into the Atlantic as their boat settled lower in the water. Card's destroyers arrived and began rescuing survivors, but U-117 sank before all crew could escape. 42 German sailors went down with their submarine. U-66 escaped, damaged but operational, and limped back to France. The famous photograph of this attack showing both U-boats on the surface, U-117 being struck by explosions, while U-66 attempts to escape, became one of the iconic images of the Battle of the Atlantic. 2 days later, Card's aircraft sank U-664. Captain Lieutenant Adolf Graf commanded U-664, a Type 7 submarine on her 5th war patrol. On August 9th, the boat was caught on the surface recharging batteries. 2 Avengers attacked in coordination. The first dropped depth bombs that damaged the submarine. The second released a Fido that tracked U-664 as she attempted to dive. The acoustic torpedo struck the stern, destroying the submarine's propulsion system. U-664 surfaced again, out of control. Graf ordered the abandoned ship. The crew escaped, and Card's destroyers rescued most of them before U-664 sank. Then came U-525. Captain Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Druitz commanded this Type IXC submarine, which had conducted multiple successful patrols since commissioning. On August 11th, U-525 was running on the surface when Card's aircraft appeared. Druitz ordered a crash dive standard procedure that had saved submarines countless times. Get deep quickly, go silent, wait for the aircraft to lose contact. But these were not ordinary aircraft, and this was not ordinary anti-submarine warfare. The Avenger pilots had been specifically trained in coordinated attacks. As U-525 submerged, the lead aircraft dropped a sonobuoy, a floating acoustic listening device that remained on the surface, trailing a hydrophone into the water. The sonobuoy transmitted the submarine's movement to the circling aircraft. The second Avenger dropped a Fido directly into U-525's track. The acoustic torpedo entered the water, circled briefly, detected the submarine's propeller noise, and accelerated toward the target. Inside U-525, the crew would have heard the torpedo approaching. German hydrophone operators were skilled at detecting threats, but there was no defense against Fido. The torpedo ignored evasive maneuvers and followed the sound signature relentlessly. It struck U-525's stern, rupturing the pressure hull and flooding the aft compartments. The submarine lost power and began sinking uncontrollably past its safe diving depth. Druitz made the only decision possible emergency surface. U-525 blew all ballast tanks and rocketed toward the surface. The submarine broke into the air with water cascading from its damaged hull, but surfacing merely exposed the boat to continued attack. The Avengers were still overhead and immediately began strafing the conning tower with 50 caliber machine guns, killing the lookouts and destroying the radio equipment. Druitz realized his submarine could not be saved and ordered the abandoned ship. Card's destroyer escorts arrived and began rescuing survivors. 35 German sailors, including Druitz, were pulled from the Atlantic and taken prisoner. U-525 rolled onto its side and sank. The engagement from initial sighting to sinking lasted less than an hour. For Druitz and his surviving crew, the experience was psychologically devastating. They had believed U-boats controlled the Atlantic. They had been trained that submarines were nearly invulnerable when submerged. Instead, they had been tracked, attacked, and destroyed by weapons they had never encountered before, acoustic torpedoes that hunted them underwater and aircraft that could locate them anywhere in the Atlantic. Card's first combat cruise ended with 3 confirmed U-boat kills in 11 days. The task group returned to Norfolk for resupply and immediately deployed again with fresh air crews. On the second cruise in October, Card sank 2 more U-boats. By the end of 1943, CARD had become the most successful anti-submarine carrier in the Atlantic, with multiple commanders and aircrews receiving Navy crosses for their actions. Other escort carriers rapidly adopted the aggressive hunter-killer tactics. USS Core, under Captain Marshall R. Greer, deployed in June 1943 and sank 2 U-boats on her first patrol. USS Santee sank 1 submarine before being transferred to the Pacific. USS Croatan deployed in early 1944 and would eventually sink 7 U-boats, tied with CARD for the highest total of any escort carrier. The pattern was consistent across all hunter-killer groups: locate U-boats through ultra-intelligence and high-frequency direction finding, vector aircraft to the contact area, attack with depth bombs or FIDO torpedoes, vector destroyer escorts to prosecute survivors with depth charges. The psychological impact on German submariners was profound and immediate. For 3 years, U-boat crews had operated with the confidence that came from tactical superiority. They were hunters, stalking prey. Their submarines were technologically sophisticated, capable of diving to depths beyond the reach of most depth charges, faster on the surface than escort vessels, armed with torpedoes that could sink ships from thousands of yards away. The wolfpack tactics developed by Admiral Dönitz had turned submarine warfare into an art form, multiple boats coordinating to overwhelm convoy escorts through concentration of force. All of those advantages began dissolving in the summer of 1943. U-boats could no longer surface safely, even in mid-ocean. Aircraft appeared from nowhere, vectored by intelligence the Germans did not know was compromised. The submarine's greatest tactical strength, the ability to attack at night when visibility was poor, became irrelevant when aircraft equipped with radar could detect surfaced submarines in total darkness. Even diving offered no guaranteed safety because of the FIDO acoustic torpedoes that followed submarines underwater. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German response was desperate and largely ineffective. In September 1943, U-boats began receiving the Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedo, designed to target Allied escort vessels by homing on their propeller noise. The weapon was supposed to allow submarines to destroy their hunters, sinking the destroyers and destroyer escorts that prosecuted depth charge attacks. Initial results seemed promising. Several escort vessels were damaged or sunk by Zaunkönig torpedoes, but the Allies responded within weeks by deploying the Foxer, a towed noise-making device that decoyed acoustic torpedoes away from the ship. The Germans countered by developing improved acoustic torpedoes that could distinguish between real propeller noise and decoys, but these weapons arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change the tactical situation. U-boats began installing schnorkels, extendable breathing tubes that allowed diesel engines to run, while the submarine remained submerged just below the surface. This reduced the need to fully surface to recharge batteries, which had been the most vulnerable moment in a U-boat's patrol cycle. The schnorkel was not a German invention, but had been captured from Dutch submarines in 1940. German engineers had dismissed it as unnecessary until the casualty rates of 1943 made any defensive improvement worth implementing. Schnorkels had significant limitations. The device created a visible wake that Allied radar could detect. Running submerged with the schnorkel extended limited speed to about 6 knots, making transit times much longer. The system was mechanically unreliable, and if the valve malfunctioned while the diesels were running, the engines would suck air from inside the pressure hull, creating painful ear pressure for the crew. Most critically, schnorkels did not solve the fundamental problem. Submarines still needed to transmit radio messages, conduct periscope observations, and maneuver on the surface for sustained periods to maintain tactical effectiveness. Every one of those activities exposed them to aircraft attack. The Germans also accelerated development of revolutionary submarine designs that might restore their advantage. The Type XXI Electroboot submarine was genuinely revolutionary, a streamlined hull designed for high-speed submerged operation, massive battery capacity that allowed sustained underwater speeds of 17 knots for over an hour, and sufficient air storage to remain submerged for days. These boats would have been nearly impossible for escort carrier aircraft to hunt effectively, but the Type XXI faced severe production problems. The design required precision manufacturing beyond the capabilities of bombed German factories. Assembly was delayed by Allied strategic bombing that destroyed critical components. The first Type XXI submarine was commissioned in June 1944, far too late to influence the Battle of the Atlantic, and only 4 boats became operational before Germany's surrender, none conducting successful combat patrols. The statistical collapse of the U-boat force during 1943 and 44 was dramatic and irreversible. In May 1943, Admiral Dönitz had 240 operational U-boats, with 118 at sea. By November 1944, the average number of U-boats operationally deployed in the Atlantic had collapsed to 31. This was not because German submarine production decreased. In fact, Germany built more submarines in 1944 than any previous year. The difference was the catastrophic loss rate. U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, and faster than experienced crews could be trained. Hunter-killer groups accounted for a disproportionate share of these losses. 7 U.S. Escort carriers operating in hunter-killer groups, Bogue, Card, Kor, Croatan, Block Island, Guadalcanal, and Mission Bay sank 54 German submarines during the war. Aircraft from these carriers destroyed 31 U-boats directly through bombing and torpedo attacks. The remaining 23 were sunk by destroyer escorts operating with the carriers, usually vectored to submerged contacts by aircraft that had forced the submarine down and marked its position. Admiral Francis Lowe, in a memo dated October 1944, noted that CVE hunter-killer groups accounted for approximately 60% of all U-boats sunk by United States forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6-month period from April through September 1944. This statistic is remarkable because it demonstrates that the supposedly inferior escort carriers, the combustible, vulnerable, expendable baby flattops, had become the most effective submarine killers in the Atlantic. The human cost on both sides was staggering. Approximately 40,000 men served in the German U-boat force during World War II. 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service in the war. Most drowned in their submarines when pressure hulls were breached by depth charges or torpedoes. Others suffocated when damaged boats could not surface. Some died in the frigid Atlantic water after abandoning ship, succumbing to hypothermia before rescue arrived. German submarine commanders who survived multiple patrols spoke of the psychological strain of knowing that statistically they were unlikely to survive the war. American and Allied losses were also significant, though proportionally lower. USS Block Island, one of the most successful hunter-killer carriers with a credited score of several U-boats, was torpedoed and sunk by U-549 on May 29, 1944, becoming the only United States aircraft carrier sunk in the Atlantic during the war. 6 sailors died, though most of the crew was rescued by accompanying destroyer escorts. The loss demonstrated that escort carriers truly were vulnerable, thin-skinned, lightly armoured ships that could be destroyed by a single well-placed torpedo. 7 escort carriers were sunk during World War II, a higher proportional loss rate than fleet carriers. The vulnerability came from their merchant ship origins and lack of proper warship construction. They had minimal compartmentalization, which meant flooding from torpedo damage spread rapidly. They carried large quantities of aviation, gasoline, and ammunition, creating catastrophic fire and explosion risks. Their flight decks were wooden, offering no protection from bombs or shells. In several instances, escort carriers that were torpedoed sank in less than 30 minutes, giving crews minimal time to abandon ship. The men who flew from escort carrier decks faced their own risks distinct from enemy action. Landing on a 477-foot flight deck pitching in Atlantic storms required extraordinary skill and resulted in numerous accidents. Aircraft would miss the arresting wires, crash into the barriers, or slide off the deck into the ocean. Pilots who became lost in bad weather and ran out of fuel before finding their carrier ditched in the Atlantic, and survival time in those frigid waters was measured in minutes. Multiple pilots and aircrew were lost to operational accidents that had nothing to do with combat. Yet despite these risks and vulnerabilities, the escort carrier program succeeded beyond anyone's initial expectations. Henry Kaiser's shipyards delivered 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers between July 1943 and July 1944, 50 aircraft carriers in 12 months, an achievement in mass production that no other nation could match. The Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation built additional Bogue-class carriers. British shipyards contributed escort carriers under Lend-Lease. By 1944, the Allied navies operated over 100 escort carriers across all theatres of the war. This industrial capacity overwhelmed German strategic planning. Admiral Dönitz's calculations assumed that Allied carrier construction would be limited by the time and expense required to build fleet carriers. He never anticipated that the Americans would build over 100 small carriers on merchant hulls, deploy them aggressively in hunter-killer groups, and systematically destroy his submarine force. The Germans' technological sophistication, their advanced submarine designs, acoustic torpedoes, and wolfpack tactics proved insufficient against American industrial mass production and operational innovation. The capture of U-505 on June 4, 1944, demonstrated just how completely the tactical situation had reversed. USS Guadalcanal, an escort carrier operating as the centerpiece of Task Group 22.3, was conducting hunter-killer operations off the west coast of Africa. The task group included 5 destroyer escorts: USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, USS Chatelaine, and USS Jenks, Captain Daniel V. Gallery commanded both the carrier and the task group, and he had been planning something extraordinary for months. Gallery had already demonstrated his aggressive approach to anti-submarine warfare. In January 1944, Task Group 21.12, centered on Guadalcanal, had sunk 3 German submarines in a single patrol: U-544, U-515, and U-68. Gallery studied these engagements carefully and concluded that it should be possible not merely to sink a U-boat, but to capture one intact. The intelligence value would be enormous. German code books, cipher machines, acoustic torpedo specifications, detailed charts of minefields and defensive positions. All of this could be obtained from a captured submarine. Gallery ordered each ship in his task group to prepare boarding parties trained specifically to capture and secure a U-boat. On the afternoon of June 4th, a TBM Avenger piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert L. David spotted U-505 running on the surface about 150 miles west of Cape Blanco, French West Africa. U-505 was a Type 9C submarine under command of Oberleutnant zur See Harold Lang. The boat had departed Lorient, France, on March 16th for what would become its final patrol. U-505 had been at sea for nearly 3 months and was preparing to return to base when David's aircraft appeared overhead. David immediately attacked, dropping depth charges that bracketed the submarine. The explosions damaged U-505's stern, ruptured hydraulic lines, and caused the boat to lose depth control. Lange ordered an emergency surface, and U-505 broke into the air with water streaming from damaged hatches. More Avengers from Guadalcanal arrived and began strafing the submarine's conning tower with machine gun fire to suppress any anti-aircraft defense. Lang believed his submarine was doomed. Standard procedure required setting scuttling charges and abandoning ship to prevent capture. The crew opened sea valves to flood the boat and scrambled up through the conning tower hatch, jumping into the Atlantic. But the scuttling procedure was rushed and incomplete. The charges were set but not yet armed, and while seawater was flooding into the boat, the rate was slow enough that U-505 remained afloat. Destroyer escort USS Chatelaine arrived first and began rescuing German sailors from the water, taking them prisoner before they could observe what happened next. The gallery saw that the submarine was still afloat and made an instantaneous decision to capture it. He radioed USS Pillsbury. "Go aboard and rescue personnel. Do not board until it is certain the sub will not sink or blow up." Lieutenant Albert David, who had been flying the Avenger that initially attacked U-505, landed back on Guadalcanal, was briefed on the situation, and immediately volunteered to lead the boarding party. David and 8 sailors from Pillsbury climbed into a motorized whaleboat and raced toward the submarine. U-505 was settling lower in the water, clearly flooding. If the Germans had successfully set scuttling charges, the boat could explode at any moment. If the flooding continued unchecked, she would sink before anyone could board her. David climbed onto U-505's slippery deck, made his way to the conning tower, and descended through the hatch into the submarine's interior. The scene inside was chaotic. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination. Seawater was spraying from damaged pipes and flooding through partially opened valves. The submarine's diesel engines were still running, filling the boat with exhaust fumes. Papers and equipment were scattered everywhere as the crew had abandoned ship in panic. David and his boarding party moved quickly through the boat, locating and closing the sea valves to stop the flooding, shutting down the diesel engines, and searching for scuttling charges that might explode. Meanwhile, other sailors from Pillsbury brought pumps across in additional boats and began dewatering the submarine. Within 2 hours, U-505 had been secured. The flooding was stopped, the scuttling charges were found and disarmed, and a tow line was rigged. USS Guadalcanal took the submarine under tow and began the long journey back to Bermuda, over 2,500 miles across the Atlantic. The intelligence haul from U-505 was extraordinary. The Americans captured Enigma cipher machines and codebooks, allowing codebreakers to read German naval communications with even greater accuracy. They obtained acoustic torpedoes and technical manuals that revealed exactly how these weapons functioned, enabling development of better countermeasures. They found detailed charts showing German minefields around French ports and defensive positions throughout occupied Europe. Perhaps most valuable were the personal papers of the crew, letters, diaries, and documents that provided insight into German submarine morale and operational procedures. 59 members of U-505's crew were captured and taken to a secret prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, where they were held incommunicado for the remainder of the war. The Germans were never informed that U-505 had been captured intact. They assumed the submarine had been sunk with all hands, as happened to so many U-boats during that period. This allowed the Allies to continue reading German communications without the Germans knowing their codes had been compromised. U-505 was the first enemy warship captured at sea by the United States Navy since 1812, when USS Constitution had captured HMS Java during the War of 1812. Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor for leading the boarding party under conditions where the submarine could have exploded or sunk at any moment. Captain Gallery received the Distinguished Service Medal. The capture became legendary in naval history as an example of aggressive, innovative tactics executed flawlessly under combat conditions. But beyond the heroism and intelligence value, the capture of U-505 symbolized something more profound about the Battle of the Atlantic in mid-1944. A hunter-killer group centered on an escort carrier had not merely sunk a submarine, it had captured one intact. The Germans had gone from being the hunters who controlled the Atlantic to prey that could be taken at will. The psychological reversal was complete. German submarine crews who survived being sunk and were taken to prisoner of war camps in the United States experienced a profound cognitive dissonance. Many were transported to camps in the American interior places like Camp Ruston in Louisiana or Camp Pine in New York, where they confronted the industrial capacity that had defeated them. The camps themselves were often better supplied than German military installations. Food was abundant, medical care was readily available, prisoners received Red Cross packages and could purchase items at camp stores. For submariners who had spent months at sea eating canned food and facing constant danger, the contrast was psychologically destabilizing. Interrogations of captured U-boat commanders revealed their bewilderment at American production capacity. One commander reportedly said during debriefing, "We were told America was a soft nation that could not match German military production. Then we encountered your escort carriers. We learned you had built over 100 of these carriers. How do you fight an enemy who builds 100 aircraft carriers we did not know existed?" The interrogator's response was not recorded, but the question itself revealed the strategic blindness that had doomed the U-boat campaign. German submariners compared notes in the POW camps and reconstructed their collective experience. Nearly every boat that had encountered escort carrier hunter-killer groups had been sunk or badly damaged. The survivors realized that what had seemed like individual bad luck was actually systematic destruction. The technological advantages Germany had possessed early in the war, longer-range submarines, wolfpack tactics, acoustic torpedoes had been overcome by Allied industrial capacity, signals intelligence, and tactical innovation. The propaganda German submariners had been taught before deploying contradicted everything they experienced. They had been told the German U-boat was the most advanced submarine in the world, which was technically true in some respects. They had been assured that German tactical doctrine was superior to Allied defensive measures, which had been accurate in 1940 and 41. They had been promised that if they could sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would be forced to surrender. But by mid-1944, American shipyards were launching more than 700,000 tons of new merchant shipping every month, far exceeding what submarines could sink even during their most successful periods. The strategic situation that Admiral Dönitz faced by late 1944 was mathematically hopeless. Germany was losing submarines faster than they could be replaced, while the Allies were building escort carriers and merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely being won by the Allies, it had already been won. The only question was how long Germany would continue sacrificing submarines and trained crews in a campaign that could no longer achieve its strategic objectives. In November 1944, the average number of operational U-boats deployed in the Atlantic reached its lowest point, 31 submarines, down from 108 at the campaign's height in spring 1943. Dönitz still commanded over 200 U-boats on paper, but most were in port undergoing repairs, in training, or unable to deploy because of mechanical problems and shortage of experienced crews. The boats that did deploy operated under severe constraints. They remained submerged during daylight, avoiding areas where escort carrier hunter-killer groups were known to operate, transmitted radio messages only when absolutely necessary, and avoided convoys that appeared to have air cover. This was submarine warfare as a survival exercise rather than an offensive campaign. The human cost of this strategic failure fell primarily on the German submariners. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, 30,000 died. This 75% casualty rate exceeded that of any other military service in any nation during the war. Most died in the terrible way that submariner deaths occur, trapped in pressure hulls that have been breached, drowning as compartments flood, or suffocating when damaged boats cannot surface. Some died more slowly, in submarines that sank intact but could not be raised, the crew surviving for hours or days as oxygen ran out and carbon dioxide accumulated. The youngest casualties were boys of 16 and 17, recruited into submarine service in the desperate final year of the war when experienced crews were exhausted or dead. The oldest were veteran commanders like Captain Lieutenant Druitz, who had survived multiple patrols only to be sunk by weapons and tactics they had never encountered before. The democracy of death at sea spared no one. Engineers and radio operators and cooks died alongside commanders and torpedomen, all equal in the moment. The pressure hull failed and the Atlantic flooded in. Allied losses in the Battle of the Atlantic were also severe, though proportionally lower than German casualties. Over 30,000 British merchant seamen died, 1/5 of the pre-war merchant marine. These men wore no uniforms, received no military honours, and had few memorials, yet they stood between Nazi Germany and victory in the Atlantic. American merchant mariners suffered similar casualty rates, and the United States Navy lost thousands of sailors to U-boat attacks on warships and escort vessels. The men who served on escort carriers faced particular risks. 7 escort carriers were sunk during the war, and while most crews were rescued, hundreds died when their ships went down quickly or exploded. The victory in the Atlantic came at tremendous cost, but it was decisive. Without control of the Atlantic sea lanes, the Allies could not have concentrated forces for Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion of Normandy, on June 6, 1944, required moving millions of tons of equipment and hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic. The logistical build-up in Britain during 1943 and early 1944 would have been impossible if U-boats still controlled the mid-Atlantic. The escort carriers that closed the air gap and hunted submarines aggressively made that build-up possible. The industrial achievement that enabled this victory is worth examining closely because it represented a fundamental American advantage. Henry Kaiser's shipyards built 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers in 12 months. Each carrier cost approximately $6 million and required approximately 6 months from keel laying to commissioning. Compare this to the Essex-class fleet carriers, which cost $70 million each and required over 2 years to build. The escort carriers were not as capable as fleet carriers. They were slower, carried fewer aircraft, lacked armor, and were vulnerable to damage. But they could be built fast enough and in sufficient numbers to overwhelm German submarine defenses. This principle, overwhelming quality with quantity, or more precisely, overwhelming sophisticated but limited technology with good enough technology in massive numbers, appeared throughout the American war effort. Liberty ships were individually inferior to purpose-built cargo vessels, but over 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war, far exceeding what any other nation could construct. The M4 Sherman tank was individually inferior to German heavy tanks, but American factories built 50,000 Shermans, while Germany struggled to produce a few thousand Tigers and Panthers. The strategy worked because American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. German military planners consistently underestimated this industrial capacity. They believed that American society was too soft, too focused on civilian comfort, too lacking in martial spirit to mobilize effectively for total war. They assumed that German technological sophistication and tactical excellence would overcome any advantage in raw production numbers. These assumptions were catastrophically wrong. American society mobilized more completely than any democracy in history. Industrial production during the war exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The flood of tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, and munitions that poured from American factories overwhelmed Axis forces on every front. The escort carrier program epitomized this approach. When the Navy needed more aircraft carriers but could not build fleet carriers fast enough, industry improvised by converting merchant hulls. When hunter-killer tactics proved effective, the Navy deployed hunter-killer groups aggressively across the Atlantic. When acoustic torpedoes gave Germany a temporary advantage, American engineers developed the Foxer decoy within weeks. Speed of innovation and speed of production consistently trumped technical perfection. The legacy of the escort carriers extends beyond their specific role in the Battle of the Atlantic. They established principles that shaped post-war naval doctrine that air power was essential to controlling sea lanes, that submarines could be hunted effectively with coordinated air and surface forces, and that smaller, specialized carriers could perform critical missions that did not require fleet carrier capabilities. During the Cold War, the United States Navy operated anti-submarine warfare carriers descended conceptually from the World War II escort carriers, hunting Soviet submarines in exactly the same way that CVEs had hunted U-boats. Yet, despite their critical role, not a single escort carrier survives today. All 122 Allied escort carriers built during World War II were either sunk in combat, scrapped after the war, or converted to other uses and later broken up. The last escort carrier in United States service, USS Annapolis, was sold for scrap in December 1979. There are no museums, no preserved examples, no physical memorials to these ships that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. The reasons for this erasure are mundane. Escort carriers were built as expedient wartime measures, not as long-term capital ships. Their merchant ship hulls and light construction made them unsuitable for post-war modification. As jet aircraft replaced propeller planes in the late 1940s, the short flight decks of escort carriers became inadequate. The ships were simply obsolete by peacetime standards. While fleet carriers like USS Intrepid and USS Yorktown were preserved as museums, the baby Flattops were quietly sold for scrap metal, their steel recycled and their service forgotten by all except historians and the veterans who served on them. This forgetting is perhaps the final irony of the escort carrier story. Ships that the Navy called combustible, vulnerable, and expendable, that were mocked as baby Flattops and jeep carriers, that were never supposed to hunt submarines but only protect convoys. These ships sank more U-boats than any other American weapon system in the Atlantic. They closed the air gap that had protected submarines for years. They turned the Battle of the Atlantic from a potential strategic stalemate into a decisive Allied victory. And then they disappeared from history, remembered only in specialized naval archives and the memories of aging veterans. The German submariners who survived the war and returned to a defeated Germany carried their own memories. Many refused to discuss their experiences for decades, traumatized by what they had endured and ashamed of having served the Nazi regime. When they finally began speaking in the 1970s and 80s, their accounts revealed the psychological impact of the escort carrier offensive. They spoke of the constant fear after mid-1943, the knowledge that surfacing even briefly in mid-ocean could bring death from aircraft that appeared without warning, the claustrophobia of remaining submerged for days at a time while batteries dwindled, the terrible sounds through the hull of depth charges exploding closer and closer. One veteran submariner described the acoustic torpedo attacks. "We could hear them in the water, circling, searching for us. You knew there was nothing you could do. You could not evade them. You could not outrun them. You could only wait and hope the torpedo lost the sound signature before it found you. Usually it did not." Another described the moment his boat was forced to surface after being depth-charged. "We came up, and there were aircraft everywhere, and destroyers racing toward us. We had nowhere to go. I remember thinking this was how we would die, on the surface, helpless. Then the Americans began rescuing us, and I felt ashamed that I was relieved to be captured." These testimonies reveal the human dimension of the strategic transformation. Wars are fought with statistics and production numbers and tactical doctrine, but they are experienced by individuals who feel fear, exhaustion, relief, shame, and sometimes grace when enemies show mercy. The escort carrier offensive was statistically decisive. It reduced U-boat operational numbers from 108 to 31, sank 54 submarines, and helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. But for the men who lived through it, the experience was visceral and personal, defined by moments of terror and survival rather than strategic abstractions. The American sailors and aviators who served on escort carriers also carried memories that haunted them. Pilots spoke of the difficulty of attacking submarines, The split-second timing required to release depth bombs before the U-boat submerged, the knowledge that men were dying in the explosions below, the strange intimacy of rescuing German survivors from the water minutes after trying to kill them. Carrier crews remembered the vulnerability of their ships, the constant awareness that a single torpedo could send them to the bottom, the losses when other escort carriers were sunk and friends died. Lieutenant Albert David, who received the Medal of Honor for boarding U-505, never fully escaped the memory of descending into that submarine while it could have exploded at any moment. He survived the war and returned to civilian life, but like many combat veterans, he found that the intensity of wartime experience created a psychological gulf between those who had been there and those who had not. David died in 1979, the same year the last escort carrier was scrapped, as if the man and the ships he represented were fading from history together. The institutional memory within the Navy was more durable. The anti-submarine warfare doctrine developed during World War II shaped naval strategy throughout the Cold War. The recognition that submarines could be hunted effectively with coordinated air and surface forces led to the development of specialized anti-submarine warfare carriers, destroyer escorts designed specifically for submarine hunting, and aircraft like the P-3 Orion optimized for maritime patrol. The tactical innovations pioneered by commanders like Captain Isbell and Captain Gallery became standard doctrine taught at naval academies and war colleges. But the ships themselves, the actual escort carriers that had proven these tactics, disappeared without ceremony. USS Bogue, the first escort carrier to sink a U-boat, was sold for scrap in 1946. USS Card, the most successful hunter-killer carrier, was converted to a merchant ship and eventually scrapped in 1971. USS Guadalcanal, which had captured U-505, was decommissioned in 1946 and scrapped in 1947. One by one, the baby Flattops that had won the Battle of the Atlantic were cut, up for scrap metal, their steel recycled, their service forgotten. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.